Aotearoa to come and give some closing comments. He said to me, it's definitely not a summary, because there's been too many things talked about. But we're very lucky to have Peter here with us. He hasn't even been sitting down the front, because he's a very humble person. But Peter is actually a world-renowned leader and researcher in the area of sexual health and health education. He's worked with national and international agencies over 25 years to strengthen responses to HIV and sexual health. He's published, and this is quite baffling if you're in the academic world, over 250 scientific papers and chapters. He's authored and edited more than 50 books. He's very well known internationally for his work on health education, health promotion, social aspects of HIV, and he's the editor-in-chief of 3 international journals and associate editor of numerous others. So it's wonderful to have Peter to be able to provide some context about, and I asked him to reflect a little bit on, given his intense knowledge about the international context, how does New Zealand compare internationally? Because it's something that we don't always know about ourselves. So, thank you, Peter.
All right, thank you, Katie. Tēnā koutou katoa. It's a great privilege to be here this afternoon, perhaps not the last speaker in what's been a very busy and, engaging set of interchanges between us on such important issues. I'm actually slightly nervous, but I'll do my best to get over that in the next 10 minutes. Yes, as Katie said, I've spent a lot of my life working in the field of sex and relationships education, sexuality education, sex education, what it's called different things in different countries, but in some ways it's got a core of similarity there. I didn't have this as an ambition when I was younger. I never thought that I would spend most of my life working in this field. Like many of us, I suspect, we came to this area because of either annoyance or anger or frustration or concern, really, of one sort or another. So really all I wanted to try to do was to share just a few thoughts at the end of the day. I was terribly frightened when I was asked to speak to this particular topic, because I'm either going to be the most popular person at the end of the afternoon or the most detested person who doesn't understand anything at all. You'll be able to tell from my accent, of course, that I come from Europe, although I've worked in Australia now for a number of years. And I've worked internationally in many countries in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, where the same sorts of issues come up time and time again. And so it seems to me, if we ask the question, what have we learned? We've learned an enormous amount, and we've shared that learning here together today, all of us. Sometimes it's been put into documents of one sort or another. Clearly here in New Zealand it has, and that's a really important first step. But we're left with an enormous problem after that. What do we do with the document? How do we actually turn the document into some form of reality or other? There's loads and loads of papers. These are just a few of them, of the enormous numbers of reviews that have been done by people like Douglas Kirby, by UNESCO, by UNFPA on what are the key qualities of good quality sex or sexuality education that actually works and produces a discernible effect. And actually there's 15 features, and I was going to go through each of them in turn and offer a few thoughts, but I'm not. I'm going to change tack a little bit. But I will show you the 15 key features. There are some of them to do with the curriculum. And I think it's quite interesting that early on we heard about the importance of cultural relevance and speaking to people in their lives and their stories and their histories, their herstories, as they are lived. And that's fundamentally important all over the world. If we want this to do any good, we have to speak to people's hearts as well as their heads. We can't do the work without. There are some other things here which I think are well worth noting. Clearly focused curriculum addressing risk and vulnerability, learning going beyond attitudes, values and skills. And I know that the documentation already produced here in New Zealand does precisely that. But there are some other issues here about environment and teachers that we need to take into account. And the one thing that struck me earlier on today is that this top one, which I didn't put yellow on because I didn't think I was going to talk to it, seems to be really fundamental here. We need a supportive and enabling environment for this work, and it seems to me we probably haven't got one at the moment, although we perhaps are moving towards it. And I just want to signal what some of the reasons why I think we haven't got one, probably anywhere in the world. It's because on the one hand, sex and sexuality are everywhere and nowhere. On the one hand, sex and sexuality are good things, and yet they're bad. On the one hand, we have fear and anxiety among teachers, among policymakers, politicians, civil servants, ourselves even. I'm not so frightened now as I was a moment ago, but I'm getting over it a bit. And on the other hand, we know that we've got to be cool and normal about this. As you said earlier, not too cool about it, but cool enough to be able to talk about something which, is part of everyday life, really, isn't it? And also we've got this whole question of noise and silence. We've been a bit noisy today. But the world out there, have a chat on the bus or what other form of getting home you're going to do afterwards. Try talking to somebody you don't know and tell them what you've been up to this afternoon. See if you get noise or silence in return. I don't know. I think we've got a lot of work to do, and that relates to this outside world. This is really nothing to do with us, or it is to do with us. But you can see what an enormous task we've got on our hands. So the whole question is, how do we move forward in this really complicated environment? And as a number of the speakers have pointed out, we mustn't blame teachers. The majority of teachers are really hard-working. Perhaps some of them aren't. Oh, sorry. No, I mustn't say that. I said that once in the New South Wales Department of Education. I talked about something like that, and I was told, no, all of our teachers in New South Wales are very hard-working, Peter, and that was the end of the subject. Anyway, no, teachers do a fantastic job. They do really well, but they need support. And they need serious support, not just a bit of support. But then there's these whole issues here about difference. The world we live in today in terms of gender and sexuality is so different from the world that most of us here grew up in. If you look on websites like Tumblr and whatever, how many genders are there now in the world? I think currently there's about 300 of them. Well, I grew up in a world where the word gender wasn't mentioned at all. Then I learned there were 2. And then I learned there were more than 2. And how many sexualities are there? 150, 170, more every day. There's more and more of them coming along. How are we going to take all this into account and do so in a way that's inclusive and respectful? Because we have to, because that's the world we live in now, whether we like it or not. That's the world that young people are engaging with, and so on and so forth. And there's a whole list of points. I can make the checklist available to you, but linkage to services. We haven't heard much this afternoon, actually, about how do we get schools and colleges and education environments to interface well with health services, and how do we get health services into schools. Some parts of the world, the clinics are actually provided in schools. They're often not called sex or sexuality clinics. That's the last thing that many people would want to be seen going to in a school. But on the other hand, they may be bringing the services into schools. But I wanted to sort of shift the conversation just a little bit and talk about how we move forwards in this last 4 or 5 minutes. And I think what I've learned from the conversation this afternoon is something I think about language. I think the language that we are often comfortable with is not the language that policymakers are comfortable with, nor parents, nor people outside of this environment. And we sometimes forget that. The language of education, for example, even the word curriculum doesn't mean anything actually to the majority of people. So we need some sort of language. We need to present our evidence, in a sense, in a way that will appeal to and make sense to others. And I've always found that everyday language is much better than the scientific language that we may use among ourselves. And I'd like to just suggest a few words that I've heard today that we might want to take forward. And I think the most fundamental one is kindness, or being kind. Who doesn't want to be kind? Who doesn't want people to be kind to their kids? Who doesn't want other people to be kind towards them? A word we haven't heard so much today is fairness, but in my country of origin, the UK, advance around civil partnership, which occurred many years ago under the first Tony Blair government, occurred overnight, no debate, no real trouble about it, because the view was taking it wasn't fair. Now, in the UK, the word fairness has this rosy resonance to it that nobody wants to be considered to be unfair about anything. It doesn't have, I don't think, the same resonance here in New Zealand. But if you can find a New Zealand concept which has that same resonance, and it might be love, I'm imagining something there, it might be kindness, it might be, I don't know what it would be, but hang on to that kind of language that will resonate with people's hearts as well as their minds. Realness, we also heard mentioned about that. But beyond good evidence and a language that speaks to people's hearts as well as minds, we need good moral argument, because some people will never be convinced by all the evidence. If you want to persuade somebody that something's true, some people, as soon as you start giving them the facts, they glaze over. because they don't want the facts. What they want is the normative argument, the moral argument. And that's got to be there in that part of this package too. And I think it's interesting there will be some general principles, like perhaps around fairness, around kindness, about respect, about inclusion's a bit of a technical word now, probably best not used with a politician. But, well, unless they use it themselves and then they think they know what they mean by it. But yeah, some sort of word that conjures up at the right kind of feeling. And you may need a range of these for different politicians, different civil servants and different people to somehow get at what matters to them in order to convince them that the idea that you're putting forward was actually their idea in the first place. But then the third thing. Okay, the evidence will work with some. The normative argument will work for others. Actually, normative argument normally works for a politician on the eve before an election. You know? They fear that somehow if they don't express the right moral position on an issue, they won't win, or they will lose their seat. But you need a third thing. And the third thing, important thing, is motors and vehicles for change. That, again, is technical language. So we're thinking about people, we're thinking about communities, we're thinking about the social media, we're thinking about what it is you need to utilize to move things forwards. And that means coming together. It means meetings like this are so fundamentally important. But it means they need follow-up. If we're going to develop a community, if we're going to become part of something bigger, we need to get to know each other better, not through just being talked at or talking with, but beginning to trust each other by doing things together. And that's really fundamental in that sense. We've got to join up with sometimes groups and people we don't agree on everything with them about, but we need to form strategic alliances in order to move forwards. And that means sometimes speaking to those who you might be critical of, privately or publicly. But for the sake of moving this agenda forwards, we have to do it together. And that's crucial, I think. And we have to recognize that central to all of this are young people themselves. They're the people we're doing this for. They're the people who've run miles ahead of us already in terms of genders, in terms of sexualities, in terms of the use of the social media, in terms of developing cultures and ways of life which are so very different from those of the past, that we have to utilize that as part of a bigger social movement. Look at the change that occurred in many, many countries in the world through the use of social media devices and technologies that took politicians completely by surprise, that took us all by surprise. That has got to be a central part of what we do going forwards. So all of those three things, good evidence, good normative argument, and careful attention to strategy and getting things right, are what you call part of a practical justice approach. And I use the phrase practical justice because international experience now shows, and I really do apologize in advance of what I'm about to say, that human rights discourse has lost its traction in the majority of circumstances now. It may still have it here in New Zealand. I hope it does. But we have to use different language in order to achieve our goals. In the UK, I could never talk to a politician or a senior civil servant about human rights. They would say, that's for other countries. In Australia, I could never do the same. That would say, that's for other countries. In the USA, you can't do the same. New Zealand may be an exception, and the treaty may allow that exceptionality in certain circumstances. But for the rest of us and for other circumstances, I think we need some notion of justice, fairness, kindness, reciprocity. No, that's a big word. You find the words, and we'll go forwards together. Thank you very much.